Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? A perplexing crime. It was a particularly dismal evening when the case first came to us. The kind of London night where the gas lamps burned feebly against the creeping fog, and the streets were slick with the remnants of a passing rain. I'd just settled into my armchair with a medical journal when a sharp knock rattled the door of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, who had been sprawled across the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, stirred only slightly. "A client, Watson," he murmured without so much as glancing at the door, and one in considerable distress, judging by the urgency of that knock. I crossed the room and opened the door to reveal a pale and trembling figure. A man of slight build, his dark overcoat soaked at the edges. He clutched the brim of his hat with unsteady fingers, his eyes darting between Holmes and me as he stepped inside. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, I don't know if I am mad or if some infernal trickery is at play, but my friend, my closest companion, is gone, vanished into thin air." Holmes sat up with sudden interest. "Pray, sir, compose yourself. Tell us your name and the details of this mysterious disappearance." "My name is Lionel Armitage," the man stammered, "and the missing person is none other than Victor Tremaine, the violinist. He performed last night at the Queen's Theatre, played beautifully, as always, and then he simply vanished without a trace." Holmes's eyes gleamed at the mention of the Queen's Theatre, and he gestured for our visitor to continue. "Vanished?" I interjected. "Surely there must be some explanation. The man must have left the theatre by some means." "That's just it," Armitage cried. "He was last seen in his dressing room just after the performance. The door was locked from the inside, yet when it was forced open an hour later, there was no sign of him. His violin remained on the table, his coat still on the chair. But Victor was gone, as if he had dissolved into the very air." I turned to Holmes, expecting him to be intrigued. I was not disappointed. His expression had sharpened, his entire manner transformed from languid disinterest to keen enthusiasm. "A locked-room mystery," he murmured. "Fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Armitage, was there anything unusual about Tremaine's behaviour before his disappearance? Any strange visitors? Any enemies?" Armitage hesitated. "There was a man," he admitted, "a foreign gentleman with piercing blue eyes. He came to Victor's dressing room before the performance. I did not hear their conversation, but Victor seemed unsettled afterward." Holmes leaned forward. "Interesting. And what of the theatre itself? Who had access to that dressing room between the time he was last seen and when the door was forced open?" "Only the stagehands, the director, and myself," Armitage replied. "But none of us could have spirited him away. The window was locked from the inside, and there is no other exit." Holmes smiled, a rare thin smile that I had come to associate with the beginning of a truly confounding puzzle. He reached for his coat and hat. "Come, Watson, the game is afoot." Case Introduction. The hansom cab rattled through the rain-slicked streets of London, its wheels splashing through shallow puddles as we made our way to the Queen's Theatre. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers drumming rhythmically against his knee, his eyes half closed in thought. Our client, Lionel Armitage, had calmed somewhat since our departure from Baker Street, though the tension in his hands, clutched tightly together in his lap, betrayed his lingering distress. "Tell me, Mr. Armitage," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "what do you know of Victor Tremaine beyond his reputation as a violinist? His habits? His private affairs?" Armitage hesitated, adjusting his spectacles before responding. "Victor was a genius, Mr. Holmes, but he was not without his eccentricities. He was often secretive, prone to mood swings, and there were moments when he seemed almost paranoid. He believed someone was watching him, though he would never say who." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "And what of his professional relationships? Was there any rivalry, any jealousy among his peers?" Armitage nodded grimly. "There was one man, Anton Devereux, a violinist of considerable talent, but with a temper to match. He and Victor were once close, but of late their interactions had grown strained." Holmes opened one eye, fixing Armitage with a piercing gaze. "Strained? Over what?" Armitage hesitated. "Victor never told me the details, but there were whispers that Devereux accused him of theft, of stealing a particular composition. It was a piece Victor played during his last performance." Holmes's fingers ceased drumming. "Intriguing. A missing man. A locked room. A disputed composition. The puzzle becomes more intricate." We arrived at the Queen's Theatre just as the gas lamps flickered against the thickening fog. The grand facade loomed before us, its entrance now, quiet save for the occasional passing constable. The theatre's director, a rotund man with greying hair and a nervous disposition, met us at the door. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us in a hushed voice. "This whole affair is a nightmare. Scotland Yard has already come and gone, and they found nothing. No forced entry, no sign of struggle. It's as if the man simply disappeared." Holmes stepped inside, scanning the dimly lit hallway with a keen eye. "Then let us see what the yard overlooked." I followed as Holmes led the way toward Victor Tremaine's dressing room, the scent of old velvet and stage dust filling the air. As we neared the door, he paused, reaching into his pocket for his magnifying glass. "Watson," he murmured, "we'd observe everything. The smallest detail may prove the most crucial." With that, he stepped into the room, and the true investigation began. Early investigation. The dressing room of Victor Tremaine was a modest affair, smaller than I had expected for a man of his renown. A single gas lamp flickered against the dark wood panelling, casting long shadows across the space. A velvet curtain hung partially drawn over a small mirror, reflecting the flickering light in ghostly distortions. The air was thick with the scent of rosine and aged mahogany, mingled with the faintest trace of cologne. Holmes stepped inside, his movements deliberate, his sharp gaze sweeping the room in an instant. He produced his magnifying glass and fell into a familiar trance, his world now reduced to the minutiae before him. I took in the scene more plainly. A violin case lay open upon the dressing table, the instrument itself resting atop a silk cloth, its strings untouched. Beside it, a half-empty glass of wine stood next to a folded programme from the previous night's performance. A neatly hung coat remained on a hook near the door. Nothing appeared disturbed. "A locked room," I murmured. The window fastened, the door forced open only after his disappearance. No signs of struggle. What do you make of it, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the chair where Tremaine had presumably sat before vanishing. He ran his fingers lightly over the fabric, then examined the floor with an intensity that suggested he saw far more than I. "Curious," he finally muttered. I approached and followed his gaze, yet I saw nothing of note. Only the smooth wooden floor, unmarred by any visible clue. Holmes straightened and turned toward the dressing table. His fingers traced the rim of the wine-glass, then lifted it delicately to his nose. A flicker of interest crossed his face. "Watson, do you detect anything unusual about this?" he asked, handing me the glass. I took it, inhaling cautiously. Red wine, slightly sweet, nothing out of the ordinary. Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet I suspect it is not wine at all." I blinked. "Not wine?" Holmes set the glass down carefully and turned his attention to the violin case. He examined the instrument itself, his fingers gliding over the polished wood. Then, with a thoughtful expression, he leaned closer to the violin strings and tapped them lightly. A subtle, almost imperceptible vibration hummed in response. "Well?" I pressed, eager for insight. Holmes straightened. "There are 3 things of immediate interest in this room, Watson. First, the wine, which I believe is something else entirely. Second, this violin, which has a peculiar resonance. And third—" He turned his gaze toward the door. "Me Dieu, the fact that someone has been standing just outside, listening to us for the past 5 minutes. I spun toward the doorway, just as a shadow shifted beyond the frame. Holmes strode forward, yanked the door open, and revealed a startled figure. A man with sharp, angular features, his eyes widening in momentary panic before settling into a guarded glare. "Anton Devereux, I presume," Holmes said coolly. The violinist hesitated, then stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Yes, and I demand to know what business you have prying into Victor Tremaine's affairs." Holmes smiled, thin and knowing. "Oh, Mr. Devereux," he murmured, "I rather think you already know the answer to that. First suspects and misdirection." Anton Devereux stepped fully into the dressing-room, his piercing gaze flickering between Holmes and myself, before settling on Lionel Armitage, who had remained near the door, his expression uneasy. "This is outrageous," Devereux snapped. "I've already spoken to the authorities. I had nothing to do with Tremaine's disappearance." Holmes, unperturbed, gestured toward a nearby chair. "Please, Mr. Devereux, humour us. A few simple questions should not trouble an innocent man." Devereux remained standing. "I have nothing to hide." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Then let us begin. When did you last see Victor Tremaine?" Devereux's jaw tensed. "Shortly before his performance last night. I came to speak with him about a private matter." "Ah, yes, a matter concerning a composition," Holmes said smoothly. Devereux's fingers twitched, as if suppressing the urge to clench into fists. "He stole from me," he admitted. "A piece I wrote years ago before he was famous. He took it, reworked it, and passed it off as his own." "Did you confront him?" I asked. Devereux's lips curled bitterly. "I did, and he laughed at me, told me that in music as in life, genius takes what it pleases." Holmes tilted, his head slightly. That must have been infuriating. Devereux let out a sharp breath. I won't deny it, but I didn't harm him, if that's what you're implying. My grievances were professional, not criminal. Holmes studied him a moment longer before turning away, as if Devereux no longer held his interest. He moved back toward the violin case, his fingers idly tracing its edges. "Tell me, Mr. Devereux," he said without looking up, "where were you after the performance ended?" Devereux exhaled sharply. "At the King's Head Tavern, with half the orchestra. You can ask anyone." Holmes nodded absently. "And this piece of music you claim was stolen. Where might I find it?" Devereux hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "Here," he said stiffly. "This is my original composition. Compare it to the one Tremaine played, and you'll see the truth." Holmes took the sheet and examined it, his eyes scanning the notes with an almost mechanical precision. Then, without another word, he folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his own pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Devereux. That will be all for now." Devereux's brow furrowed. "That's it?" "For the moment," Holmes replied. "You are, after all, not our only suspect." Devereux gave Holmes a lingering glare before turning sharply on his heel and exiting the room. Armitage let out a breath. "You don't think he—" "No," Holmes interrupted. "He is angry, but he is not our man." I frowned. "Then why entertain the notion?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, Watson, the true culprit always hides in the shadow of the obvious suspect, and I rather think we have been given our first false trail." With that, he turned back to the dressing table, his fingers once more grazing the untouched violin. His expression was unreadable, but I knew that somewhere in this room a single overlooked detail was already beginning to unravel the mystery in his mind. The secret clue. Holmes stood motionless before the dressing table, his sharp eyes lingering on the violin. The room was silent except for the distant hum of the theatre settling into the late hours. Armitage and I exchanged a glance, sensing that Holmes had entered that peculiar state of deep contemplation, where the world around him ceased to exist, except for the puzzle at hand. Finally, he reached for the violin once more. But this time, instead of plucking the strings, he turned the instrument over, inspecting its underside with meticulous care. His fingers ran along the polished wood, pausing at a nearly imperceptible seam. A soft hum of interest escaped him. "Curious," he murmured. I stepped closer. "What is it?" Instead of answering directly, Holmes took his magnifying glass from his coat and examined the violin under its lens. After a few moments he let out a quiet chuckle. "Watson, you see but do not observe. Look here, just beneath the tailpiece." I leaned in, my eyes straining against the dim light. At first I saw nothing of interest, but then there it was, a hairline crack no longer than half an inch, running along the grain of the wood. It was barely noticeable, yet Holmes studied it as though it were a cipher waiting to be decoded. "A damaged violin?" I asked. "Not damage," Holmes corrected. "Tampering." I frowned. "You suspect something was hidden inside?" Holmes gave a satisfied nod. "Precisely." He set the instrument down and turned his attention to the dressing table. With swift efficiency, he examined every surface. The drawers, the velvet lining, even the underside of the table itself. Finally, he paused before the wine glass he had inspected earlier. Lifting it again, he swirled the remaining liquid and tilted it toward the gaslight. A faint shimmer caught my eye, a subtle, almost oily residue clinging to the glass. Drugged, Holmes muttered. I stiffened. You mean Tremaine was poisoned? Not necessarily poisoned, Holmes corrected. More likely sedated. The effect would have been swift. A few sips, and he would have been dazed, sluggish. He set the glass down with a measured hand. This explains why there was no sign of struggle. He was taken without resistance. Armitage, who had been listening intently, spoke for the first time in several minutes. But how? The door was locked from the inside, the window fastened. If he was taken, where did his captor vanish to? Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his lips. That, Mr. Armitage, is the very question we must answer. He turned back to the violin, his gaze narrowing, and I suspect the key to that answer lies within this instrument. At that moment, a sharp knock sounded at the door. We turned as a young stagehand, breathless and pale, stepped inside. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "there's something you need to see." Another message, left backstage. Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed intensity. "Ah, the plot thickens." Without another word, he grabbed his coat and strode out the door, leaving Watson and Armitage scrambling to follow. Rising stakes, the backstage area of the Queen's Theatre was a flurry of movement. Stagehands hurried to and fro, adjusting props, checking costumes, and preparing for the next evening's performance. The young man who had summoned us led the way, his eyes darting nervously, as though he feared we would soon uncover something he would regret. Holmes, however, was singular in his focus. He scanned the room with a predator's precision, his gaze darting over every corner, every shadow, before it fixed on a small crumpled envelope pinned to the backstage wall by a single thumbtack. "Here," the stagehand said breathlessly, pointing to the envelope. Holmes approached with his usual deliberation. He retrieved the note carefully, his gloved fingers not touching any more of the paper than necessary. With an almost imperceptible flick, he unfolded it and began to read aloud. "A game of shadows and strings, played too long. The violinist will not return. You have one night to catch me, or another will vanish. The melody ends tomorrow." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with menace. I exchanged a look with Armitage, whose face had gone pale. "This is madness," he muttered. Who could leave such a message?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. A man with a mind bent on theatrics. Someone who relishes the game. He folded the note back into its envelope with care and handed it to the stagehand. "Ensure that this is passed along to the authorities." The young man nodded and scurried off, leaving us alone in the dim, cluttered room. Holmes turned toward the rear exit and began walking without a word, his steps quick and purposeful. "Holmes," I ventured, "who do you believe is behind this?" Holmes didn't answer at once, his eyes flickering between the shadows that gathered in the corners of the backstage area. "I have a theory," he replied at last, "but it remains incomplete. This message is both a taunt and a challenge, but it also offers us something, a clue, if you will." He stopped short, turning to face me. "The mention of the violin. A game of shadows and strings. It cannot be a coincidence." I felt a shiver of realization creep down my spine. You think the violin itself is part of this game? Indeed, it is both the instrument and the symbol, Holmes answered, his gaze far away, as if he were seeing more than the present moment. The stolen composition, Devereux's grievance, and now this cryptic message. Someone is orchestrating a very precise drama, Watson, and it involves more than just Victor Tremaine's disappearance. I struggle to keep up with his rapid deductions. What do you mean? And what does it all have to do with this message? Holmes continued to walk, and I followed closely behind. I believe the message refers to another victim, perhaps one yet to be claimed. Armitage, who had been silent up to this point, spoke up in a trembling voice. Another victim? But Tremaine's disappearance was already baffling enough. Who else could be involved? That, Holmes said, is the question, and, unfortunately, it's a question that will only become clearer as the hours pass. We have only one night to prevent another disappearance. One night to uncover the identity of the man behind this game before he strikes again. The tension in the air seemed to thicken, a heavy cloak descending on us all. The stakes had escalated quickly, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down. The thought of a second victim, a second vanishing, added an urgency to Holmes's already fevered pace. We had no time to waste. "Holmes, we need to act quickly," I urged, feeling the gravity of the situation. "We must return to the theatre, search every inch of it. The culprit is still among us." Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Yes, Watson. But there is one final piece of the puzzle that must be examined before we can proceed. The violin. It will reveal more than we yet know." With that, he quickened his stride, his silhouette melting into the darkened streets ahead. Holmes's strategic play. The streets of London seemed colder as we made our way back to the Queen's Theatre. Holmes' brisk pace never faltered, and I struggled to match his stride, my mind racing with the implications of the night's developments. The cryptic message, the violin, and the looming threat of another victim. All of it swirled in a disorienting whirlpool of suspicion and uncertainty. We arrived at the theatre not long after, where Holmes wasted no time in instructing the stagehands to secure the premises. The entire building was to be searched, from top to bottom. Holmes believed the answer lay not in what we had already seen, but in what we had missed, and there was one place in particular that had caught his attention. "The orchestra pit," he said as we gathered near the entrance to the stage. "I want to inspect it thoroughly." Armitage, who had followed us in silence since our arrival, raised an eyebrow. "The orchestra pit? But surely it is merely a place for musicians to sit during the performance." Holmes fixed him with a sharp glance. "It's precisely because it is so innocuous that I believe it may hold the answer. The game the perpetrator is playing involves misdirection, a deliberate effort to distract us. We've focused too much on what is obvious. Now, we must focus on what is concealed." We made our way down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the orchestra pit, the air thick with the smell of resin and old velvet. The orchestra had long since dispersed, but the space still felt alive with the echoes of the last performance. Holmes moved like a man with purpose, his eyes scanning every surface, every shadow, as though he could feel the pulse of the theatre in his bones. As we reached the pit's edge, Holmes gestured for Armitage and me to follow him down. The space was cramped, littered with discarded sheet music and forgotten instruments. Yet, amid the clutter, Holmes moved with a quiet intensity, his fingers brushing over the remains of last night's performance. "Watson," he called, "come here." I approached, bending to peer over his shoulder as he examined the floor. "What is it, Holmes?" He didn't answer at first, his eyes narrowing on a spot near the far corner. Slowly, he crouched, then placed his hand against the floorboards, testing their integrity. There was a faint creak as he pressed harder, a subtle shift in the wood. "It's not solid," Holmes muttered to himself. I blinked. "Not solid? What do you mean?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with recognition. "There's a compartment here, Watson, hidden beneath the floor. A place where something or someone could be concealed." I knelt beside him, now fully aware of the gravity of his discovery. With a quick motion, Holmes pried the floorboards free, revealing a small concealed space beneath them. It was empty, save for a single object, a violin bow. Holmes carefully lifted the bow, his expression unreadable. "This bow is not Victor Tremaine's," he said, his voice low with significance. "It belongs to someone else, someone who was here last night." I looked at the bow, its wood dark and worn. There was nothing particularly distinctive about it, yet it felt like the final clue falling into place. Holmes stood, his mind already several steps ahead. "This bow is the link we've been missing," he said, his voice sharper now with clarity. "The second victim, Watson. It is not enough to have a stolen composition or a vanishing violinist. No, there is something far more personal at play here. Tremaine was the first, but the second is already in the wings." Before I could respond, there was a loud noise, a distant shout from the far end of the stage. Holmes's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "It begins!" With swift precision, he motioned for us to follow him. "Gather the stagehands. We need to move quickly." We rushed through the backstage area, heading toward the main hall. The tension was palpable as Holmes's steps grew quicker, his face set in a grim determination. The game had shifted, the trap was set, and the predator was now in the open. Holmes paused just before entering the main theatre, holding up a hand to stop us. He turned to face us, his expression colder than I had ever seen it. "Remember, Watson, the key to this game is not merely to catch the culprit, but to understand why they play at all. This is not about money or revenge. No, this is a game of control, of power over those who cannot see the strings." I felt a chill at his words. "And the violin?" "The violin is a symbol," Holmes said, "a tool, and the bow." He paused, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. "The bow is the instrument of execution." Before I could ask further, there was another shout from the stage, a cry of terror that echoed through the hall. Holmes motioned for us to hurry. The game, it seemed, was about to reach its final act. The reveal. The theatre was thick with the sharp tang of fear and anticipation as we entered the main hall. The stage, once a place of performance and artistry, now felt like a hunting ground, a place where the rules of the game were no longer clear. The cry that had echoed through the hall had come from the wings, and as we rushed toward the sound, Holmes's expression was one of quiet determination. Armitage, slightly ahead of us, turned and cast a desperate glance over his shoulder. "Holmes, what are we dealing with? What exactly is happening here?" Holmes gave a glance to the stage. His eyes were sharp, focused, though his words were measured. "A calculated act of control, Armitage. A manipulation of art. A performance in its purest form, but not for the audience's benefit. The perpetrator does not seek admiration. They seek power." We passed through the curtains to the side of the stage, the gaslights flickering overhead, casting elongated shadows across the wooden boards. There, sprawled on the floor, lay a body. A man, pale and lifeless, his face contorted in terror. His fingers still clutched a violin bow, the very same one Holmes had discovered beneath the pit. I felt my stomach drop at the sight. The second victim. Holmes approached the body with the same deliberate care as he had with every other aspect of the case. Tremaine's bow, but not Tremaine himself, he muttered to himself, inspecting the scene with a rapid yet thorough examination. "This is not a coincidence." I knelt beside him. "Who is he, Holmes?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, instead studying the body with great intensity. The man was dressed in an ordinary black suit, nothing to suggest that he was of particular significance. Yet something about his posture, the way he held the bow, suggested he was not an unwitting participant. He had been part of this macabre game. Armitage, still standing by the stage, called out, "I believe I recognize him. This man. He's one of the musicians. I believe his name is Samuel Pritchard, a violinist in the orchestra." Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on the victim. "Pritchard, you say? That explains much." He stood and turned toward Armitage, his eyes sharp with insight. "Pritchard is not the true target, Armitage. He was, instead, a pawn in this game, a symbolic gesture to send a message. The real objective of our perpetrator is something much greater." Armitage, now confused, stepped forward. But why Pritchard? Why this elaborate charade with the violin and the bows? Holmes paused, glancing down at the lifeless body. "The answer lies in the composition, Armitage, the stolen piece of music, Tremaine's great work. You see, someone sought to rewrite history, to claim a place in the annals of musical genius. Pritchard was, quite simply, a tool in a twisted symphony, an accomplice in a larger performance, but it was never meant to be his bow that killed him." Armitage's eyes widened in realization. "You're saying it wasn't Pritchard who was supposed to die?" "Exactly." Holmes's gaze never wavered from the body, his voice as cool and detached as ever. Pritchard's role was to create the illusion of a threat. His death would be a dramatic finale, a punctuation in the crime. The true target, however, was the one who orchestrated this all, the mind behind the game. Suddenly, Holmes turned swiftly, his eyes flashing. "We must return to the dressing room," he said, his tone decisive. "What? But the killer is here," Armitage protested. "The killer is not here, Armitage," Holmes replied, a sharp edge to his words. "The killer is somewhere else entirely, and we must act quickly before they vanish once more." With no time to waste, we made our way back to the dressing rooms. As we passed the familiar backstage corridors, the tension in the air felt thicker, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Holmes's steps were measured, precise, his mind calculating each move. We reached the dressing room, and Holmes immediately turned his attention to the violin case, which still lay untouched on the table. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. Everything appeared normal, except for one small detail. Holmes lifted the sheet of music that had been placed beside the violin. It was the stolen composition, the piece that had been the catalyst for all of this. As his fingers traced the edges of the paper, his face lit up with the light of discovery. "Here it is," Holmes said, his voice almost triumphant. "The final clue." He held the sheet of music up for us to see. At first it appeared like any other piece of classical music, but upon closer inspection there were subtle changes. Notes had been altered, deliberately adjusted to create a discordant, unsettling melody. "This is what the perpetrator was after," Holmes continued. "The composition was never meant to be a work of art. It was meant to be an instrument of chaos, an operatic score for the perpetrator's twisted performance." I stared at the music, finally understanding. "You mean the changes in the composition were the killer's signature?" "Indeed." Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod. "Our perpetrator is not merely a musician. They are a composer of death, manipulating every note, every action to fit a script. And now, Watson, we know who they are." With a swift motion, Holmes returned the music to the case and turned on his heel. "Come, Watson. It's time to unmask the true mastermind of this tragic symphony." The aftermath. The silence in the dressing room was oppressive as we stood there, the truth hanging just out of reach. Holmes's revelation had left me breathless, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place, yet the identity of the true mastermind remained elusive, like a shadow in the periphery of my vision. Holmes, however, was no longer merely observing. He was acting. With an intensity that only he could muster, he strode to the door and beckoned for Armitage and me to follow. "We need to speak with one more person before the curtain falls on this matter, Watson," he said. Armitage, still disoriented by the whirlwind of recent events, hesitated. "But Holmes, the man is dead. Pritchard, who could still be a threat." Holmes turned sharply, his eyes gleaming with an almost unsettling calmness. "The threat, Armitage, is not in the dead. It is in the living. Those who remain after the music has played its final note, and our culprit has not yet finished their composition." With that, we left the dressing room and made our way down to the lower levels of the theatre, where the staff had gathered in a confused cluster. Among them stood the orchestra's conductor, a stern man by the name of Edgar Moreau, whose face seemed to have aged a year in the span of a few hours. His eyes darted nervously as he noticed Holmes approaching. Holmes stopped a mere few feet from Moreau, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Moreau," he began, his tone formal but unmistakably sharp, "we must speak." Moreau stiffened, the slightest tremor in his hands betraying the facade of composure he was desperately trying to maintain. "What is it now, Holmes? Another body? Another victim?" His voice was strained, but his eyes held something else, something deeper, perhaps even guilty. "I am afraid the answers you seek are no longer to be found in the bodies, Mr. Moreau," Holmes replied, his voice quiet yet resolute. "The final act of this drama lies with you." The conductor's face turned ashen. "What are you suggesting?" he demanded, his eyes flicking toward Armitage and me. "You can't possibly mean—" "Indeed I do." Holmes's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. "You, Mr. Moreau, are the composer of this twisted symphony. You've played us all, conducting your deadly game from behind the scenes. The stolen music, the disappearing violinist, the orchestrated deaths, it all leads back to you." For a moment, Moreau said nothing. The weight of Holmes's accusation hung heavy in the air, and I could almost hear the man's heartbeat in the stillness that followed. Then, with a long, drawn-out breath, he seemed to crumble, his defiance slipping away as the truth, like a final, unrelenting note, struck him. "You are right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It was all my doing. The deaths, the disappearances, they were all part of the plan. But you must understand, Holmes, it was never about killing for the sake of killing. It was about something far more profound. It was about reclaiming what was mine." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. "Reclaiming?" he echoed, his voice almost intrigued. "What exactly did you feel was yours to take, Mr. Moreau?" Moreau looked away, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of a nearby table. "The composition, the one that Tremaine stole from me years ago. It was my creation. I composed it when I was just a boy, long before Tremaine even knew what a violin was. But when he heard it, he stole it, claiming it as his own. He made it his great work, and the world lauded him for it. I was nothing but a forgotten man, a footnote in his success." Holmes nodded, as if he had expected this. "But you didn't just want your work back, did you, Mr. Moreau? You wanted more. You wanted to rewrite the past, to take control of the narrative, to ensure that the world knew you were the true genius behind the music." Moreau's lips curled into a twisted smile. "Yes, that's it. The world needed to understand that it was I who had created it, my symphony, my masterpiece. But it wasn't enough to simply reclaim it. I needed to prove that I was the greater composer, that I could orchestrate a series of events so magnificent, so intricate, that it would be impossible for anyone to deny me my due." I glanced at Holmes, who stood still, taking in every word with unshaken poise. "So, you orchestrated a series of deaths, Mr. Moreau. You used Pritchard and Tremaine as pawns in your game, all for the sake of your own pride and bitterness?" Moreau didn't flinch. "I was careful. I knew how to play the game. Tremaine's death was an accident, a necessary sacrifice to make the world take notice. Pritchard, too, was part of the performance, a final act that would complete the narrative I had created. And you, Holmes, you were merely the unexpected conductor. But in the end, it was my masterpiece that would be recognized." Holmes, ever calm, gave a slight nod. "You're quite the artist, Mr. Moreau, though I would argue that your masterpiece is a tragedy rather than a triumph. Your desire for recognition has blinded you to the true nature of genius, which lies not in control, but in humility." Armitage, still processing the events, stepped forward. "And the violinist? What about the disappearance? Was that also part of your plan?" Moreau's expression faltered for the first time. "The violinist, Victor Tremaine, was supposed to disappear, yes. I planned to kill him, but then he disappeared on his own. It threw everything off course, and when Pritchard was murdered in such a public manner, I realized the game had changed, but it was too late to stop. Holmes paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the confession to sink in. Then he stepped back, signalling for the constables who had quietly surrounded the room to move forward. "Mr. Moreau," Holmes said softly, "the performance is over." As the officers moved to arrest the conductor, I turned to Holmes, whose expression had not changed. His eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Well, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice tinged with something close to satisfaction. "Another case closed, though I fear that Moreau's desire for fame will leave a far longer mark on history than his own music ever will." We watched as Moreau was escorted from the theatre, his face still bearing the twisted remnants of his obsession. The theatre, once alive with the music of his design, now stood in quiet ruins, a fitting end to the symphony of deceit he had composed. I glanced at Holmes, who was already walking toward the exit, his mind seemingly on the next case, the next puzzle. "Holmes," I asked as I followed, "how did you know it was him all along?" Holmes turned, his lips curling into that familiar, almost imperceptible smile. "Ah, Watson, it's simple. The motive, the method, and the music, each note was a clue, and the final chord told me all I needed to know." With that, he stepped into the London night, and I followed, ready for whatever mystery would come next. Outro. The streets of London were slick with rain, the cobbled stones reflecting the dull glow of the gaslights as we walked side by side. The night air was cold, cutting through our coats, but Holmes, as usual, seemed indifferent to the chill. His mind was elsewhere, as it always was after the resolution of a case. We had left the theatre behind us, its doors now closed to the world, and the haunting echoes of the tragedy were fading with each step we took. The arrest of Edgar Moreau had been swift, and the case was finally over. But even in the calm after the storm, I could see that Holmes was still processing, still turning over the events in his mind, as if they were pieces of a puzzle, yet unsolved. "Holmes," I began, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "You were right. The motive was there from the start. But I can't help but wonder, what do you think of Moreau's philosophy? His belief that genius is something to be claimed, to be controlled at any cost?" Holmes glanced at me, his eyes sharp, reflecting the dim light of the gas lamps as we passed. There was a flicker of something, perhaps amusement or pity, in his expression, but his voice was thoughtful, measured. "It is a tragic notion, Watson. Genius, like any true form of greatness, cannot be coerced or manipulated. It is a gift, given freely to those who do not seek to own it, but rather to share it with the world." Moreau's obsession with ownership, his desire to control the narrative, blinded him to the simple truth that genius, in its purest form, belongs to no one and to everyone at once. I nodded, reflecting on his words. It's hard to comprehend, really. To think that someone could go to such lengths, taking lives, orchestrating such a twisted symphony, all for the sake of their own vanity. Holmes gave a slight shrug, his lips curling into a small smile, though there was no mirth in it. "Such is the nature of vanity, Watson. It blinds one to everything but the reflection in the mirror. But the truly remarkable men and women, the ones who change the world, do not seek to be remembered. They seek only to create. Their genius is not measured by how many accolades they receive, but by the beauty and depth of their work. Moreau's music, for all his grandiosity, will be forgotten in time, for it was nothing but an attempt to mimic true greatness. We walked in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of our footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the city. As we reached our flat, Holmes slowed his pace, glancing at the sky where the first signs of dawn were beginning to break. The stars had begun to fade, and the early morning light cast a pale glow over the rooftops. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice quieter now, "in cases like these, one is often left with a strange sense of melancholy. We catch the criminal, we untangle the mystery, but in the end, the true tragedy is not in the crime itself, but in what drives a man to commit it. Moreau's obsession with his own recognition. It was a tragedy not only for the victims, but for him as well. He spent his life chasing something that was never truly his to possess." I looked at him, impressed by his reflection. "You're right, Holmes. In the end, what do we have? A man who thought he could control the course of history, and yet all he succeeded in doing was destroying his own soul." Holmes gave a small nod, his gaze still distant. "Yes, Watson, it is always a delicate balance, this dance between genius and madness. Moreau was a man consumed by the desire to shape the world in his image, but in doing so, he forgot that the true power lies not in the ability to control, but in the humility to let go." He stopped suddenly, turning to face me with an expression that for once was free of the usual aloofness. There was a depth to his gaze, an almost unspoken understanding. "But that is, of course, the nature of the game we play, is it not? We pursue the truth, follow the clues, uncover the secrets, yet, in the end, we are all left to wonder. What is the true nature of this elusive thing we call justice?" I stared at him, taken aback by the question. "Justice, Holmes? Isn't that what we've been pursuing all this time?" Holmes smiled, but it was not the usual knowing smile that accompanied his deductions. It was more contemplative, a smile tinged with an understanding that went beyond mere logic. "Perhaps, Watson, or perhaps we are simply playing our part in a much larger story, one that will unfold in time beyond the reach of our understanding." We stood there for a moment, the world around us quieting as the city stirred awake. The fog, which had been so thick earlier, was lifting, revealing a London that was both familiar and new, as if it had been waiting for the dawn to clear its thoughts. "Well, Watson," Holmes said finally, breaking the silence, "another case solved. But I suspect, as always, that the next one is already waiting around the corner, ready to present us with new mysteries, new puzzles to unravel." I chuckled softly, grateful for the return of his usual manner. "And so we move on, as we always do. But I must admit, Holmes, I'm beginning to wonder if there will ever come a time when we are truly finished." Holmes looked at me with that familiar gleam in his eye. "Finished? My dear Watson, we are never truly finished. We are merely passing through the chapters of a never-ending book, and the more we read, the more we realize there is always something yet to be discovered." With that, he turned and walked up the stairs to our flat, and I followed, knowing full well that the adventure, like the city itself, was far from over. And so, with a final glance at the London skyline, I closed the door behind me, ready for whatever mystery lay ahead.